What if I told you that the United States government once dropped a bomb from a helicopter onto a residential neighborhood in Philadelphia? That soldiers were given medals for what was essentially a one sided incident against unarmed people? That the FBI spent decades secretly trying to destroy civil rights organizations, and we only know because someone broke into an office and stole the files? You've heard the polished version of American history, the one in textbooks with clean narratives and heroes. But there's another history, one that got buried under careful language, convenient omissions, and decades of silence. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 17 events in American history that powerful people tried very hard to make you forget. Not because they were small or insignificant, but because they were uncomfortable. These are moments that got reframed, minimized, or erased from the official record, sometimes for generations. We'll move slowly through each one, gently because even dark history deserves to be told with care. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, maybe hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this, and let's talk about the history that didn't make it into your textbook. Starting with a forced march in 1838 that was called relocation for far too long. Trail of Tears. So we start in 1838, which is earlier than you probably thought we'd start, but that's kind of the point. This stuff goes back a long way. The Trail of Tears is one of those phrases that sounds almost poetic until you realize it's describing something that absolutely was not. It refers to the forced removal of tens of thousands of Native Americans, primarily from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. The destination was Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, and the journey was, to put it extremely mildly, not a pleasant one. Now, here's the thing. This wasn't some chaotic, spontaneous event. This was policy. Official, signed into law policy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, gave the federal government the authority to negotiate treaties that would exchange Native American land in the East for land in the West. Negotiate is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because in practice, many of these treaties were signed under coercion, or by individuals who didn't have the authority to represent entire nations, or were just flat out ignored when convenient. The Cherokee Nation actually took their case to the Supreme Court and won, twice. But Andrew Jackson, in a move that can only be described as deeply unconstitutional and also extremely on brand for him, reportedly said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "The Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Which is a wild thing for a president to say, but there we are. So the removals began, and they were brutal. Families were rounded up, often with little warning. Homes were abandoned or burned. Crops were left in the fields. People were marched, sometimes at gunpoint, over 1,000 miles in conditions that ranged from terrible to unsurvivable. We're talking about winter marches, inadequate food, no shelter, overcrowded conditions, and diseases like cholera, dysentery, and measles spreading through the groups like wildfire. Historians estimate that around 4,000 Cherokee people died during the removal, which was roughly a quarter of the entire nation. 4,000. That number is hard to even process. It's not a battle. It's not a skirmish. It's a policy that led directly to the suffering and loss of thousands of lives. And here's the uncomfortable part that stayed uncomfortable for a very long time. For generations, American textbooks framed this as relocation or Indian removal, using language that made it sound like a neutral administrative action, like changing someone's mailing address. The human cost was downplayed, the suffering minimized, the voices of the people who experienced it largely absent from the narrative. It wasn't until much later, really not until the latter half of the 20th century, that the term Trail of Tears became widely used and the full scope of the tragedy was acknowledged in mainstream historical accounts. Even then, it took decades more for this to be taught with the weight it deserved. The thing about calling something a removal instead of what it actually was, a forced displacement that led to mass suffering, is that it allows people to feel less bad about it. It creates distance. It turns human beings into statistics and tragedy into policy. And that distance makes it easier to move on, to not think too hard about what was lost. Entire communities, cultures, ways of life, all uprooted because the land they lived on was suddenly valuable to someone else. That's not ancient history. That's 1838. That's not that long ago, relatively speaking. Your great 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 grandparents were alive then, probably. It's close enough to touch. But of course, this wasn't the only time something like this happened. In fact, it's just the beginning of a very long pattern. And if you thought forced marches were the darkest it got, well, let me gently guide you to the next event, where we'll see what happens when the government decides that even a forced march is too much effort and opts for something a lot more immediate. Wounded Knee, we're staying with Native American history for a moment because the next event picks up where the last one left off, sort of. Except now it's 1890 and we're no longer talking about forced removal. We're talking about something that happened in one cold, brutal day in December on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was called the Battle of Wounded Knee for a very long time. Calling it a battle is like calling a car accident a vehicular disagreement. It was not a battle. It was an incident involving U.S. Army troops and Lakota Sioux men, women, and children, and the details are about as dark as history gets. Here's the backdrop. By 1890, the ghost dance movement had spread among many Plains tribes. It was a spiritual movement, a religious practice that promised renewal and the return of the old ways. It was peaceful. It was about hope. But U.S. authorities saw it as a threat, something that might inspire resistance or uprising, and they responded with fear and force. Sitting Bull, a prominent Lakota leader, was taken into custody and lost his life during the encounter in mid-December. Tensions were incredibly high. Troops were nervous, the Lakota were grieving and afraid. On December 29th, 1890, a group of Lakota, led by Chief Bigfoot, were camped near Wounded Knee Creek. They were on their way to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry. The soldiers ordered the Lakota to surrender their weapons. Accounts vary on exactly what happened next, but at some point a shot was fired. Maybe it was accidental, maybe it was intentional. It doesn't really matter because what followed was chaos. The troops opened fire with rifles and rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns, which are essentially small cannons that can shoot explosive shells. These were used on a group that included a significant number of women, children, and elderly people who were trying to flee. When the gunfire stopped, over 150 Lakota were gone, though some estimates put the number closer to 300. Many of the bodies were found miles from the camp, suggesting people had been pursued and shot while running away. The army suffered casualties too, though many of those were likely from their own crossfire in the chaos. It was cold, bitterly cold, and a blizzard moved in shortly after. Bodies were left in the snow for days before they were buried in a mass grave. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. 20 soldiers from that day were awarded the Medal of Honor. 20. The nation's highest military decoration, for what was essentially a one-sided incident. The official designation as a battle helped justify this. It reframed what happened as a military engagement rather than what it actually was, and that framing stuck for a long, long time. Textbooks, when they mentioned Wounded Knee at all, often described it in passive, vague language. A confrontation occurred. Violence broke out. as if it were a weather event and not a direct result of decisions made by people in positions of power. It wasn't until the 1970s, really, that activists and historians began pushing back hard against this narrative. The American Indian movement brought national attention to Wounded Knee, both the historical event and the ongoing injustices faced by Native communities. Slowly, painfully, the official story began to shift. But the medals were never rescinded, and the word used to describe what happened, though it changed in some circles, still isn't universal in how the event is described in official documents. There's something deeply unsettling about how long it took for the truth of Wounded Knee to be widely acknowledged, about how language was used to obscure what happened, about how a tragedy was dressed up as a victory for so long that generations of Americans learned a version of history that simply wasn't accurate. And that brings us, in a way that's unfortunately quite smooth, to our next event, where we'll see another example of violence being buried under language and a community's suffering being erased from the official record for decades. Tulsa race incident. Now we jump forward a few decades to 1921 and we land in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Specifically, we land in a neighborhood called Greenwood, which was also known by another name, Black Wall Street. And yes, that name was literal. Greenwood was one of the most prosperous African American communities in the entire country. We're talking about a thriving business district with restaurants, hotels, theaters, newspapers, schools, hospitals, and successful Black-owned businesses that served a community of around 10,000 people. It was a place where Black families had built wealth, stability, and independence in a country that made all three of those things extremely difficult to achieve. And then over the course of about 18 hours in late May and early June of 1921, it was destroyed. Here's how it started, or at least, here's the story that was used to justify what happened next. On May 30th, a young Black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a downtown building. The elevator operator was a white woman named Sarah Page. What exactly happened in that elevator is unclear. Some accounts say he tripped and grabbed her arm to steady himself. Some say he stepped on her foot and she screamed. What we know for certain is that she screamed, he ran, and by the next day, the newspapers were reporting that he had attacked her, using language that was designed to inflame racial tensions. He was arrested. A white mob gathered at the courthouse, demanding he be handed over. A group of Black men, some of them World War I veterans, showed up armed to protect him from what they correctly assumed would be a lynching. Shots were fired. The situation spiraled. What happened next wasn't a riot. It was an organized assault. White mobs, some of them deputized by local authorities, which is a detail worth sitting with for a moment, moved into Greenwood and began systematically burning and looting. Homes were set on fire. Businesses were destroyed. People were shot in the streets, in their homes, while trying to flee. Witnesses reported that small planes flew overhead, dropping incendiary devices and firing at people below. Planes, in 1921, being used against American citizens in an American city. When the smoke cleared, the Greenwood district was gone. Over 35 blocks were reduced to ash. Estimates of those who lost their lives range from around 100 to 300, though the exact number will probably never be known because many bodies were buried in mass graves or disposed of in ways that left no record. And here's the part that makes this story even darker, if that's possible. For decades, this event was barely mentioned. It didn't appear in Oklahoma history textbooks. It wasn't taught in schools. Survivors were discouraged from talking about it. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot clauses in policies. The city didn't investigate. The state didn't investigate. It was, for all practical purposes, erased from the official record. When it was mentioned at all, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot, which is a fascinating bit of linguistic misdirection because riot implies chaos, spontaneity, two sided violence. What happened in Tulsa was none of those things. It was targeted, it was planned, it was carried out with the complicity of local law enforcement and government officials. It wasn't until the 1990s, 70 years later, that Oklahoma formed a commission to investigate what had happened. Survivors, the ones who were still alive, finally got to tell their stories on the record. Mass graves were discovered. The scope of the destruction was documented, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to enter the public consciousness. In 2001, the commission released a report that recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. As of the time I'm recording this, those reparations have not been paid. The last known survivors, now over 100 years old, have spent their entire lives watching the place they called home be forgotten, then minimized, then finally, reluctantly, acknowledged. The Tulsa incident is a perfect example of how history gets buried. Not by accident, not because people forgot, but because the people in power decided it was easier to move on if they didn't talk about it. If they used softer language, if they blamed the victims, if they just didn't mention it in textbooks. And it worked for a very long time, until it didn't. Until the survivors and their descendants refused to let it stay buried. Which brings us, gently and inevitably, to another example of violence being reframed, minimized, and tucked away where it wouldn't make anyone too uncomfortable. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. Sand Creek Incident. Let's rewind a bit, back to 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War. Most of the country's attention was focused on that conflict, which meant that what was happening out west didn't get quite as much scrutiny as it might have otherwise. And what was happening out west, specifically in Colorado Territory, was another one of those events that got labeled with a word that made it sound less horrific than it actually was. For a very long time, it was called the Battle of Sand Creek. Calling it a battle is like calling a house fire a temperature event. It was an incident where U.S. Army troops attacked a peaceful village, and the aftermath was so disturbing that even people at the time were appalled, though not appalled enough to do much about it, apparently. Here's the setup. The Cheyenne and Arapaho people had been living on the Great Plains for generations, but by the 1860s, white settlers were moving into the area in increasing numbers, especially after gold was discovered in Colorado. Tensions rose, conflicts broke out. In 1861, tribal leaders signed the Treaty of Fort Wise, which drastically reduced their territory, though many Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders disputed whether the treaty was legitimate or whether the people who signed it had the authority to do so. By 1864, the situation was volatile. Some young warriors were conducting raids on settlements. The territorial governor declared that all friendly Native Americans should report to specific locations for protection. Chief Black Kettle, a Cheyenne leader who had consistently advocated for peace, led his people to Sand Creek, about 40 miles north of Fort Lyon, believing they would be safe there. They were told they would be under military protection. They were wrong. On November 29th, 1864, around 700 troops from the Colorado Territory Militia, led by Colonel John Chivington, rode to Sand Creek. The village was flying an American flag and a white flag of surrender, both clearly visible. Black Kettle believed this would protect them. It did not. Chivington's orders, which he gave to his men before the attack, included a phrase that I'm going to paraphrase here because the actual quote is deeply disturbing, but it essentially amounted to taking no prisoners and showing no mercy to anyone, regardless of age. The troops surrounded the village and opened fire. People tried to flee. Some tried to surrender. It didn't matter. What followed was several hours of violence that left between 150 and 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people gone, most of them women, children, and elderly individuals. The men of fighting age were mostly away hunting. Now, here's where it gets even worse, and I apologize because I know we're trying to keep this gentle, but this detail matters for understanding how the event was later framed. The soldiers didn't just attack the village, they mutilated bodies afterward. They took body parts as trophies. Some of these were later displayed publicly in Denver. When word got back to Washington, there was outrage. Congress held hearings. Military investigations were conducted. Some officials condemned Chivington's actions in the strongest terms. And yet, Chivington was never prosecuted. He'd already resigned from the military by the time the investigations concluded, which conveniently meant he couldn't be court-martialed. He returned to civilian life and lived another 30 years without facing any legal consequences for what happened at Sand Creek. But here's the really insidious part. Despite the investigations, despite the condemnations, the official record for a very long time referred to this as the Battle of Sand Creek. Calling it a battle implied two-sided combat. It implied military engagement. It made what happened sound legitimate, even heroic. Some accounts praised it as a victory over hostile forces. Chivington himself defended his actions for the rest of his life, insisting that he'd done the right thing. And for decades, that narrative persisted in certain circles. It wasn't until much later, well into the 20th century, that the historical consensus shifted definitively toward acknowledging what Sand Creek actually was. In 2007, the site was designated a National Historic Site, and the Park Service's materials now use accurate language to describe what occurred. But that took 143 years. A century and a half for the official story to catch up with the truth. There's something exhausting about how many of these events follow the same pattern. Violence happens. It gets called something else. The people responsible face no real consequences. Decades or even centuries pass before the record gets corrected, and by then, the damage is done. Generations have learned a sanitized version of history. The victims and their descendants have spent lifetimes being told that what they know happened didn't happen the way they remember it. Which brings us, unfortunately, smoothly to another event where the official version and the actual version were very different, and where it took a very long time for anyone to acknowledge that difference. Wilmington coup. Now we're going to shift gears slightly and talk about something that happened in 1898, which is notable for being the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. Yes, you heard that right. A coup. In America. In North Carolina, specifically in the city of Wilmington. And if you're thinking, wait, I definitely didn't learn about an American coup in history class, well, that's exactly the point. This event was so thoroughly buried, so comprehensively erased from the national narrative that most Americans had never heard of it until very recently. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't in textbooks. It was a local story that stayed local for over 100 years, even though what happened had national implications. Here's the context. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, Black men gained the right to vote and hold office. In Wilmington, which had a majority Black population, this led to a period of relatively integrated government. By the 1890s, the city had a multiracial city council and a white Republican mayor who worked with Black officials and representatives. The city was prospering. Black-owned businesses were thriving. There was a Black-owned newspaper, the Daily Record, that had a circulation throughout the state. For white supremacists, this was intolerable. They saw integrated government as an affront, a threat to the social order they wanted to maintain. And so they decided to do something about it. In the lead up to the November 1898 election, a campaign of intimidation was launched. white supremacist groups, including a paramilitary organization called the Red Shirts, threatened black voters. They conducted what they called a White Declaration of Independence campaign, which is a phrase that should make your skin crawl. The election itself was marred by fraud and voter suppression, but even that wasn't enough for the people orchestrating this. 2 days after the election, on November 10th, a mob of around 2,000 armed white men gathered in Wilmington. They marched to the offices of the Daily Record and burned the building to the ground. Then they moved through the city, targeting black residents and anyone who opposed them. The exact number of people who lost their lives that day is unknown because records were deliberately obscured. Estimates range from 60 to more than 300. Black residents fled the city in droves, some at gunpoint, leaving behind homes, businesses, and property. The mob then forced the mayor and the city council to resign at gunpoint and installed their own officials. They literally overthrew a democratically elected government and replaced it with one of their choosing, a coup, on American soil. And then, having successfully seized power, they set about making sure everyone forgot it happened. For over a century, this event was referred to, when it was mentioned at all, as the Wilmington Race Riot. Again, that word, riot, doing a tremendous amount of work to obscure what actually occurred. Riots are chaotic. Riots are spontaneous. What happened in Wilmington was neither. It was planned. It was organized. It was executed by people who then wrote the history books and made sure their version of events was the only one that got told. They framed it as a spontaneous uprising of concerned citizens, restoring order rather than what it was, which was a violent overthrow of legitimate government by white supremacists who couldn't tolerate black political power. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began seriously investigating what had happened in Wilmington. Descendants of survivors started speaking out. In 2006, a state commission issued a report that officially acknowledged the events as a coup and called for the historical record to be corrected. Textbooks slowly began to change. Memorials were erected, but the damage was already done. 4 or 5 generations of Americans had grown up never knowing that this happened, and even now it's not widely taught. It's still a story that most people have never heard. The Wilmington coup is a masterclass in how history gets erased, not by accident, not through neglect, but through deliberate action by people who understood that if they controlled the narrative, they could control how the event was remembered. And it worked. It worked for more than 100 years, which is a sobering reminder that the stories we tell about the past are not neutral. They're chosen, they're shaped by people with power, and sometimes those people decide that certain stories are better left untold. But of course, stories have a way of resurfacing, even when they've been buried deep. Which brings us to another example of how the government can make things disappear, at least for a while. Japanese-American internment. Let's jump forward to World War II, specifically to 1942, just a few months after Pearl Harbor. The country was reeling. The attack had been devastating, both in terms of lives lost and national morale. Fear was everywhere. And fear, as we've seen repeatedly throughout this documentary, makes people do terrible things. In this case, it made the US government decide that everyone of Japanese descent living on the West Coast was a potential threat to national security. Not because there was any evidence of espionage or sabotage. Not because anyone had actually done anything wrong, but because of their ancestry. And so, in February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent. Let's be very clear about something. About two-thirds of these people were American citizens, born here, raised here. American citizens who had committed no crime, who were given no trial, who were simply rounded up and sent to what the government called relocation centers, but which were, let's be honest, prison camps. They were given sometimes as little as 48 hours notice to pack up whatever they could carry and report to assembly points. Everything else, homes, businesses, property, had to be sold immediately or left behind. And because everyone knew these families were being forced to leave, the prices they got for their property were, unsurprisingly, terrible. People lost everything: entire life savings, generational wealth, gone. The camps themselves were located in remote areas, often in deserts or swampland. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Families lived in cramped barracks with no privacy, no insulation, and minimal furniture. The conditions were harsh. Summers were blazing hot. Winters were freezing. Medical care was inadequate. And all of this was happening to American citizens whose only crime was having Japanese ancestry. Meanwhile, German Americans and Italian Americans, though sometimes subjected to scrutiny and restrictions, were not mass incarcerated. The policy was explicitly racial. Now, here's what makes this particularly galling. The government knew even at the time that this wasn't about security. Military intelligence reports concluded that mass incarceration wasn't necessary. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was not exactly known for being soft on perceived threats, said it wasn't justified. But the policy went forward anyway, driven by racism, war hysteria, and political pressure from West Coast politicians who saw an opportunity to remove economic competitors and seize valuable property. And once the war ended, once people were finally released, there was no real effort to help them rebuild. No reparations, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They were just sent home to communities that often didn't welcome them back, to properties they no longer owned, to lives that had been completely destroyed. For decades, this was barely discussed. It was mentioned in history books, if at all, as a wartime necessity, a regrettable but understandable measure taken during a crisis. The word internment itself is a euphemism, a softer word that makes imprisonment sound more official and less unjust. The government didn't apologize until 1988, 46 years later, when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Rights Act of 1988, which provided a formal apology and monetary reparations to surviving internees. Each survivor received $20,000, which works out to about $45,000 in today's money, which is something, certainly, but it's not generational wealth. It's not decades of lost opportunities. It's not childhood spent behind barbed wire. It's an acknowledgement, finally, that what happened was wrong. But it came so late that many of the people who'd been incarcerated had already passed away. The Japanese-American internment is a perfect example of how wartime fear can be used to justify things that would be unthinkable in peacetime, and how, once the fear subsides, it becomes very convenient to just not talk about what was done, to move on, to frame it as an unfortunate necessity rather than a profound violation of civil rights. But the people who lived through it didn't have the luxury of moving on. They carried that trauma for the rest of their lives, and their children carried it, and their grandchildren are still carrying it, because that's how historical injustice works. It doesn't just affect the people it happened to. It echoes forward through generations. And speaking of echoes, our next event takes us to another moment when workers discovered that standing up for fair treatment could be met with violence, and where the official story took a very long time to catch up with what actually happened. Ludlow incident. All right, let's shift our focus to labor history for a moment, because if there's one thing American textbooks love to gloss over, It's the history of workers getting brutalized for asking for basic rights. We're heading to Colorado in 1914 to a coal mining camp called Ludlow, where the tension between workers and mining companies had been building for years and was about to explode in one of the most tragic incidents in American labor history. This is a story about people who just wanted fair wages, safe working conditions, and the right to join a union, and what happened when they dared to ask for those things out loud. So here's the background. In the early 1900s, coal mining was brutal work. Dangerous, exhausting, and poorly paid. The miners in southern Colorado worked for companies like the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which was owned in part by John D. Rockefeller Jr. The companies controlled everything. They owned the mines, obviously, but they also owned the towns where the miners lived. Company towns, they were called. The miners lived in company housing, bought food and supplies from company stores, and were paid in scrip, company currency that could only be used at those stores. It was a closed system designed to keep workers dependent and prevent them from accumulating any real money or independence. The working conditions were appalling. Safety regulations were basically non-existent. Cave-ins and explosions were common. Miners were often cheated on their wages because coal was weighed by company scales that were, shall we say, not always accurate. By September of 1913, the miners had had enough. The United Mine Workers Union called for a strike. The demands were reasonable, almost painfully modest. They wanted an 8-hour workday, which was already law in Colorado but wasn't being enforced in the mines. They wanted fair weighing of the coal they mined. They wanted the right to choose where they shopped and where they lived. They wanted the companies to follow existing safety regulations. These were not radical demands. These were basic requests for dignity and safety. The companies refused. All of them. Completely. When the strike began, the mining companies evicted the workers and their families from company housing. In September, in Colorado, where winter was coming, the union scrambled to set up tent colonies where the striking families could live. The largest of these was at Ludlow near the town of Trinidad. By the time everything was set up, about 1,200 people were living there, men, women, and children, in canvas tents as the weather turned cold. The companies, meanwhile, hired private security guards, including members of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, which was essentially a union-busting mercenary group. These guards, along with the Colorado National Guard, which the governor had called in supposedly to keep the peace, surrounded the tent colonies. There were regular incidents, shots fired into the camp at night, harassment, intimidation. The miners armed themselves for protection. The whole situation was a powder keg. On April 20th, 1914, it exploded. Accounts differ on exactly how the violence started that morning. Some say the militia fired the first shots. Some say it started with an argument. What's not disputed is what happened next. The National Guard and company guards opened fire on the tent colony with rifles and machine guns. The miners fired back. Families tried to hide. Some dug pits under their tents for shelter. The battle, and it was a battle this time, a real one, lasted all day. By late afternoon, the guardsmen moved into the camp. They looted tents. They set them on fire. And in one of those tents, in a pit that had been dug underneath for safety, 2 women and 11 children suffocated and perished from the smoke and flames. The pit was later called the Death Pit. The youngest child was just 3 months old. When the fires died down and the smoke cleared, at least 25 people were gone, including those 13 in the death pit. The exact number is hard to pin down because some bodies may have been removed or hidden. News of the violence spread quickly. In what became known as the 10-Day War, miners and other workers across southern Colorado armed themselves and attacked mines and guard posts. It took federal troops to restore order. By the time everything finally calmed down, Somewhere between 69 and 199 people had lost their lives, depending on which count you believe and whether you include minors who were later hunted down and vanished. Now, here's the part that should make you angry. The official narrative for decades framed this as a labor disturbance or industrial unrest. Those are the actual phrases used, as if it were a minor inconvenience, a scheduling conflict, and not an incident where the state militia and private mercenaries set fire to tents with women and children inside. No one from the National Guard was ever prosecuted. No one from the mining companies faced charges. John D. Rockefeller Jr. testified before Congress and expressed sympathy but took no responsibility. The miners who survived were often the ones who ended up facing legal consequences for fighting back. The Ludlow incident became a rallying cry for the labor movement, but in mainstream American history, it was quietly shuffled aside. It didn't fit the narrative of American progress and prosperity. It was uncomfortable. It showed the government and powerful corporations working together to crush workers who just wanted safe jobs and fair pay. It wasn't taught in most schools. It wasn't in most textbooks. It took decades before historians really started examining what happened and why. In 1918, the United Mine Workers built a monument at the site. In 2003, the site was designated a National Historic Landmark. But for most of the 20th century, if you asked the average American about Ludlow, they'd have no idea what you were talking about. The thing about the Ludlow incident is that it's not just about what happened on April 20th, 1914. It's about how that event was remembered, or rather, how it was deliberately not remembered. It's about how language was used to minimize violence, how incident replaced words that might sound more accusatory, how the focus shifted away from the people who lost their lives and toward abstract discussions of labor relations and economic policy, as if those things existed separately from the human beings affected by them. The families who lost children in the death pit didn't get justice. They got silence. They got a historical record that treated their tragedy as a footnote, an unfortunate outcome of unrest, rather than the direct result of choices made by powerful people who valued profit more than human life. And this pattern, this deliberate erasure of violence against workers, wasn't unique to Ludlow. It happened over and over again in American labor history. Which brings us smoothly to another event where Black workers organizing for fair treatment were met with overwhelming violence, and where the official death count was so obviously wrong that it's almost insulting, except it's not almost insulting. It's actually insulting. Because when you minimize the number of people who were lost, you minimize the horror of what happened. You make it easier to forget. You make it easier to move on without accountability. And that's exactly what happened in Arkansas in 1919 in a place called Elaine. Elaine incident. So we're staying in the South, and we're staying in the year 1919, which was not a great year for racial justice in America, as we'll be discussing more in a bit. But first, let's talk about Elaine, Arkansas, a small town in Phillips County where Black sharecroppers were trying to do something that should have been completely reasonable, but which turned out to be nearly lethal. They were organizing to get fair prices for their cotton. That's it. That's what started this. People wanting to be paid fairly for their work. And what happened next was one of the deadliest incidents of racial violence in American history, with a death toll that was deliberately suppressed for decades. Here's the setup. After the Civil War, sharecropping became the dominant economic system in the South for Black farmers. In theory, it was supposed to be a fair arrangement. The landowner provided land and supplies, the sharecropper provided labor, and they split the profits from the crop. In practice, it was basically a system designed to keep Black farmers in perpetual debt. The landowners controlled the accounting, they set the prices for supplies, they determined what the crop was worth, and somehow, mysteriously, at the end of every season, The sharecroppers always owed more than they'd earned. It was exploitation dressed up as employment, and it trapped entire families in cycles of poverty that lasted for generations. By 1919, some black farmers in Phillips County had had enough. They formed the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, a group dedicated to getting better prices for their cotton and challenging the exploitative sharecropping system. They hired a lawyer, they started organizing meetings. This was seen as dangerous by the white landowners and businessmen who profited from the existing system. Black people organizing, black people hiring lawyers, black people demanding fair treatment. These were all threats to the social and economic order. And threats had to be put down. On the night of September 30th, 1919, Union members were meeting in a church near Hoop Spur, a small community near Elaine. It was late, around 11 at night. According to the sharecroppers' accounts, a group of white men, including a sheriff's deputy, drove up and fired shots into the church. The people inside fired back, and in the exchange, the deputy was struck and later passed away. That's the version the sharecroppers told. The white community told a different story, claiming the black Union members had ambushed law enforcement. Regardless of who fired first, what happened next was unambiguous and horrifying. Word spread that black people were in open revolt, which was absolutely not true. But truth wasn't particularly important at that moment. White mobs formed, armed themselves, and began hunting black people throughout the area. White men came from surrounding counties, from Tennessee, from Mississippi. Some estimates put the mob at over 1,000 men. The governor called in federal troops, ostensibly to restore order, but the troops largely sided with the white mobs or stood by while the violence continued. Over the next several days, black people were hunted down, shot in their homes, in fields, on the roads. Some were taken prisoner and later vanished. Families fled into the swamps to hide, where some stayed for days without food or water. The official death toll reported by white authorities was absurdly low. They claimed that 5 white men and 25 black people had perished. Even at the time, everyone knew that was a lie. Black newspapers and civil rights organizations conducted their own investigations and put the number at closer to 100, possibly as many as 200 or even more. Bodies were dumped in the river. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Some simply disappeared, and their families never found out what happened to them. The exact number will probably never be known because the people in charge of keeping records had every incentive to make the death toll seem smaller than it was. A low number made it look like a minor disturbance that was quickly controlled. A high number would have required acknowledging that a sustained campaign of racial terror had been carried out with the complicity of law enforcement and the military, and then, in a move that adds insult to horror, the authorities arrested the black Union members who survived and charged them with inciting the violence. 12 men were quickly tried, convicted, and sentenced to be executed. The trials were a farce. They lasted less than an hour each. The defendants had inadequate legal representation. The juries were all white. The verdict was predetermined. It took years of appeals and intervention by the NAACP before the convictions were eventually overturned. But the message had been sent. Black people who organized, who demanded fair treatment, who challenged the economic system that oppressed them, would be met with overwhelming violence, and then they'd be blamed for that violence. For decades, the Elaine incident was barely mentioned outside of Arkansas. When it was discussed, it was usually called the Elaine Race Riot, which, once again, is a completely inadequate term for what happened. A riot implies spontaneous chaos. What happened in Elaine was a planned and systematic attack on black people who had dared to organize for economic justice. The white mobs knew what they were doing. The authorities knew what they were doing. This wasn't confusion or panic. This was terrorism. It wasn't until much later, really not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that historians started seriously investigating the Elaine incident and trying to establish what had actually happened and how many people had truly perished. In 2004, a historical marker was finally erected at the site. In recent years, there have been efforts to document the names of victims and to seek some form of acknowledgement or reparations for descendants. But for most of the 20th century, this event was forgotten deliberately by everyone except the people whose families had lived through it. They remembered. They passed the stories down. They kept the truth alive even when the official record tried to erase it. The Elaine incident is particularly instructive because it shows how official death tolls can be manipulated to change the perception of an event. 25 dead sounds unfortunate. 200 dead sounds like an atrocity. And if you're trying to downplay an atrocity, the easiest way to do it is to lie about the numbers. That's what happened here. The people in power knew exactly what they were doing when they reported that absurdly low figure. They were managing the narrative. They were protecting themselves and the social system they benefited from. And it worked for a very long time. Which brings us to another incident from that same terrible year where racial violence erupted in a northern city and where once again, the official story managed to obscure the truth for decades. East St. Louis incident. Now we're going to backtrack just slightly to 1917 and head north to East St. Louis, Illinois, which sits right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. This is important because when people hear about racial violence in the early 20th century, they often assume it was exclusively a Southern problem. It was not. It was everywhere. And the East St. Louis incident is a particularly stark reminder that racism and racial terror were national issues, not regional ones. What happened in East St. Louis over 2 days in July of 1917 was devastating. And like so many of these events, it was downplayed, minimized, and eventually overshadowed by other news, specifically World War I, which was dominating the headlines at the time. Here's the context, and it's going to sound familiar because the same economic anxieties that fueled violence in other places were at work here too. During World War I, factories in East St. Louis were booming. They needed workers. At the same time, the Great Migration was underway, with hundreds of thousands of Black Americans leaving the South and moving north in search of better jobs and less overt racism. Spoiler alert, they found the jobs, but not necessarily less racism. In East St. Louis, the Black population grew rapidly. White workers, many of them immigrants themselves, who'd only recently arrived from Europe, saw Black workers as competition for jobs and housing. Labor unions, which should have been organizing all workers together, instead often excluded Black members and stoked racial resentment. Some factories deliberately hired Black workers as strikebreakers, which pitted Black and white workers against each other instead of against the employers who were exploiting both groups. Tensions had been building for months. There were scattered incidents of violence. White mobs attacked Black workers. Black residents armed themselves for protection. On July 1st, 1917, a car full of white men drove through a Black neighborhood shooting into houses. When another car appeared later that night, a group of Black residents, thinking it was the same attackers returning, fired on it. It turned out to be an unmarked police car. 2 officers were struck and passed away. That was the spark. The next day, July 2nd, white mobs gathered and began attacking Black residents throughout the city. What happened over the next 2 days was a sustained campaign of violence. Black people were pulled from streetcars and beaten. Homes were set on fire, and when residents fled, they were attacked in the streets. Children were not spared. Elderly people were not spared. Mobs roamed the city looking for Black victims. The police, when they intervened at all, often sided with the white mobs or arrested Black people for defending themselves. The National Guard was called in, but their response was slow and, in some cases, ineffective or even complicit. By the time the violence subsided, the official death toll was listed as around 39 black residents and 8 white residents. But those numbers, as with so many of these events, are almost certainly too low. Estimates from journalists and civil rights investigators at the time put the actual black death toll closer to 100 or even higher. Bodies were thrown into the river. Some were never recovered. Some families fled the city and never reported their missing members because they were too afraid to come back. The destruction was immense. Hundreds of buildings were burned. Thousands of black residents fled the city, either temporarily or permanently. The economic losses for the black community were staggering, and the psychological impact, the trauma of being hunted in your own city by your neighbors, by people you'd lived alongside, that doesn't have a dollar value you can attach to it. That just lives in people, and in their children, and in their children's children. In the immediate aftermath, there were investigations. Congress held hearings. There were calls for justice. A few people were prosecuted, mostly black men who defended themselves. Some white rioters were also prosecuted, though they generally received lighter sentences, but the larger structural issues, the economic competition, the housing segregation, the labor union exclusion, the police complicity, none of that was seriously addressed. And then as the months went by, the country's attention shifted. World War I was escalating. American troops were deploying to Europe. The East St. Louis incident became yesterday's news. It faded from the national consciousness, overshadowed by what was happening overseas. For decades, it was barely taught. It wasn't in most history textbooks. When it was mentioned, it was usually lumped in with other race riots, as if it were just one of many unfortunate incidents, rather than a specific event with specific causes and specific people responsible. The language of riot once again did a lot of work to obscure what actually happened. Riots are disorganized. What happened in East St. Louis had organization. There were mobs that coordinated their movements. There were deliberate decisions not to intervene by authorities who could have stopped it. This wasn't random chaos. This was targeted violence against a specific community. It wasn't until much later that historians really started examining the East St. Louis incident in detail and placing it in the larger context of racial violence in early 20th century America. In 1917, when it happened, it was shocking. It made national news, but it was also, in a sense, just one more example of something that kept happening over and over in different cities for similar reasons. And that repetition perversely made each individual incident easier to forget. Oh, another incident. Oh, more racial violence. It became almost normalized, which made it easier to move on without addressing the root causes. The East St. Louis incident is also a reminder that labor competition and economic anxiety can be weaponized to fuel racial violence. The factory owners who hired black workers as strikebreakers weren't doing it out of commitment to racial equality. They were doing it to break unions and keep wages low. They pitted workers against each other based on race, and white workers, instead of recognizing that they were being manipulated, directed their anger at black workers rather than at the bosses. That's not an accident. That's a strategy. And it worked. The violence in East St. Louis achieved exactly what the people in power wanted. It kept workers divided, it kept unions weak, and it kept the economic system exactly as it was. The people who suffered were the workers, black and white, but especially black. And the people who profited were the ones who never had to set foot in a mob or throw a punch. They just had to watch it happen and then go back to business as usual. Which brings us to another moment when people in power watched violence unfold and did nothing to stop it. This time involving veterans who'd served their country and were asking for what they'd been promised. Bonus Army, let's move forward to 1932, right in the middle of the Great Depression, when the entire country was struggling. Unemployment was at 25%. People were losing their homes. Banks were failing. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. And in the middle of all this suffering, a group of World War I veterans decided to ask the government for something they'd been promised, a bonus that was supposed to be paid to them for their military service. What happened next is one of those moments that makes you wonder how it's possible that this isn't talked about more, because it involves the U.S. Army using tanks and tear gas against American veterans on American soil. But we'll get to that. Here's the background. During World War I, soldiers were paid about $1 a day, which was significantly less than what factory workers were making back home. To make up for this disparity, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act in 1924, which promised veterans a bonus based on their length of service. The catch was that the bonus wouldn't be paid until 1945. That's right. They'd have to wait over 20 years to get the money they'd earned. Each veteran received a certificate, basically an IOU from the government, that would mature in 1945 and could then be redeemed for cash. In good economic times, waiting 21 years might have been annoying but manageable. In 1932, with the Depression devastating the country, it was impossible. So the veterans organized. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army. Starting in May of 1932, they began traveling to Washington, D.C. from all over the country. They came by car, by train, by hitchhiking. Some walked. They brought their families. By mid-June, somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 veterans and their family members had set up camps in the city. The largest camp was on the Anacostia Flats, across the river from the capital. They built shanties out of scrap materials, canvas, and whatever they could find. It looked like a Hooverville, those makeshift camps named after President Hoover that were springing up all over the country, filled with people who'd lost everything. The veterans were remarkably organized and disciplined. They set up a command structure. They held daily parades. They sang patriotic songs. They were careful to present themselves as orderly, respectful, and patriotic, which they were. These were men who'd fought in the trenches of France, who'd survived poison gas and artillery barrages, who'd served their country when it asked them to. And now they were asking their country to help them when they desperately needed it. Their demand was simple: pay the bonus early, not cancel it, not increase it. Just pay it now instead of in 1945, because their families needed food and shelter today, not in 13 years. The House of Representatives actually passed a bill to pay the bonus early. There was genuine sympathy for the veterans, but the Senate voted it down in mid-June. Most of the veterans stayed anyway. They had nowhere else to go. Some thought that maybe if they kept up the pressure, Congress would reconsider. Others simply had no money to get home. The Hoover administration wanted them gone. They saw the camps as an embarrassment and a potential threat to public order. By late July, the patience of the authorities had run out. On July 28, 1932, the police were ordered to clear some veterans from abandoned buildings near the Capitol where they'd been staying. A confrontation broke out. 2 veterans were shot and passed away. That gave the administration the excuse it needed. President Hoover ordered the Army to clear out the bonus Army camps. And he didn't send just any troops. He sent active duty soldiers led by General Douglas MacArthur, with Major Dwight Eisenhower as his aide, and Major George Patton commanding tanks. Yes, tanks. Against unarmed veterans and their families. MacArthur exceeded his orders. Hoover had instructed him to clear the downtown area, but not to cross the river into the main camp at Anacostia Flats. MacArthur ignored that. In the late afternoon, the Army assembled at the White House and then marched down Pennsylvania Avenue with fixed bayonets, tear gas, and tanks. They pushed the veterans back, burning their makeshift shelters as they went. Then they crossed the bridge into Anacostia and cleared that camp too. They set fire to the shanties. Families fled with whatever they could carry. Children were crying, people were choking on tear gas. One baby, an infant, died from exposure to the gas. A boy was bayoneted in the leg. The images of American soldiers attacking American veterans, of camps burning, of families fleeing with their belongings, were captured by photographers and newsreel cameras. The whole country saw it. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Public opinion turned sharply against Hoover. This was seen as brutal, unnecessary, and deeply un-American. The veterans had been peaceful. They'd been asking for something they were legitimately owed. And they'd been met with military force. In the presidential election that November, Hoover was crushed by Franklin Roosevelt. And while there were many reasons for that loss, the Bonus Army incident was definitely one of them. When Roosevelt took office, one of his first acts was to offer the remaining veterans jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. And eventually, in 1936, Congress overrode a presidential veto and paid the bonus early after all. But here's the thing. Despite the dramatic images and the political impact at the time, the Bonus Army incident faded from national memory pretty quickly. It became a footnote, a minor episode from the Depression. It's not taught in most schools. Most Americans have never heard of it. Which is strange, because it's a pretty significant moment. The U.S. Army attacking veterans who were peacefully asking for what they'd been promised. You'd think that would be the kind of thing that sticks in the national consciousness, but it didn't. Maybe because it was overshadowed by everything else that was happening during the Depression. Maybe because it was embarrassing for everyone involved. Maybe because once the bonus was finally paid, people decided the story had a happy ending and moved on. But for the veterans who were there, who were gassed and chased from the capital of the country they'd served, there was no happy ending. There was humiliation, trauma, and the knowledge that when they'd needed help, their government had responded with violence. And that's a hard thing to forget, even if everyone else does. Which brings us to another labor uprising, one that was even bigger and even more violent, and that involved something most people would find shocking. The U.S. government using airplanes to drop bombs on American citizens. Battle of Blair Mountain. Now we're going back to 1921, and we're returning to coal country, this time in West Virginia. If you thought the Ludlow incident was bad, wait until you hear about Blair Mountain, which was the largest armed insurrection in the United States since the Civil War. We're talking about 10,000 to 15,000 coal miners, many of them veterans of World War I, fighting a pitched battle against coal company security forces and local law enforcement, with the U.S. Army ultimately getting involved. There were machine guns, there were airplanes, there were bombs, and for decades, this was barely mentioned in American history books, because apparently a 5-day war involving thousands of people in West Virginia wasn't considered important enough to teach. Let's set the stage. West Virginia coal miners in the 1920s were living in conditions that were somehow even worse than what we described at Ludlow. The coal companies controlled everything: the housing, the stores, the police, even the clergy. Miners were paid in scrip that could only be used at company stores, where prices were inflated. They lived in company-owned housing that could be terrible and overcrowded. Safety conditions in the mines were abysmal. And if you try to join a union or complain about any of this, you could be fired, evicted, blacklisted, beaten, or worse. The companies hired private security forces, often called mine guards or Baldwin Felts detectives, who acted as a private army. They intimidated workers, they broke up union meetings, they conducted what amounted to domestic terrorism against anyone who challenged company control. By 1921, miners in southern West Virginia had had enough. Union organizers had been working to bring the United Mine Workers Union to the region, but they faced violent opposition. On May 19, 1921, Baldwin Felt's agents arrived in Matewan, a small mining town, to evict families of striking miners from company housing. The town's police chief, Sid Hatfield, who supported the miners, confronted the agents. Gunfire broke out. When the smoke cleared, 7 agents and 3 townspeople, including the mayor, were gone. Hatfield became a hero to the miners, a symbol of resistance against company power. But the companies wanted revenge. On August 1st, 1921, as Hatfield was walking up the courthouse steps in Welch, West Virginia, to face trial on other charges, he was shot multiple times by Baldwin Felt's agents. He passed away on the steps. The agents were later acquitted, claiming self-defense, even though Hatfield had been unarmed and shot from behind. When news of Hatfield's demise reached the miners, it was the final straw. They'd tried organizing, they'd tried strikes, they'd tried working within the system, and every time they were met with violence and legal impunity for the people who attacked them. So they decided to fight back. Thousands of miners gathered in Lenz Creek near Charleston. They armed themselves, many with rifles they'd brought back from World War I. Their plan was to march south to Logan and Mingo counties, where the coal company's grip was strongest, and free the miners there who were still under company control. It was an army, a real one, organized and determined. The governor tried to negotiate. He sent federal mediators, but the miners were beyond negotiation. They'd been pushed too far for too long. Standing in their way was Logan County Sheriff Don Chaffin, who was essentially a company man. He'd built a small army of his own, hundreds of deputies, mine guards, and volunteers, all paid by the coal companies. They dug in on Blair Mountain, a ridge that controlled access to Logan County. They set up machine gun nests. They had high ground and fortified positions. When the miners arrived at the base of the mountain in late August, a battle began that would last for 5 days. It's hard to overstate how large and intense this was. 10 to 15,000 armed miners on one side, 2,000 to 3,000 company forces on the other. Both sides had machine guns. There were trenches, like in World War I. Historians estimate that over 1 million rounds where ammunition were fired. The sound of gunfire was constant and could be heard for miles. Private planes hired by the coal companies flew over the miners' positions, dropping homemade bombs and gas from leftover World War I supplies. Yes, planes bombing Americans in America, on American soil, in 1921. Let that sink in. President Warren Harding eventually authorized federal troops to intervene. On September 2nd, Army units arrived, including bombers and surveillance planes. Faced with the prospect of fighting the U.S. Army, most of the miners surrendered. The battle ended. Hundreds were arrested and charged with various crimes, including treason and murder. A few were convicted, though most were eventually released or had their convictions overturned. No one from the coal companies or the sheriff's forces faced any charges, despite the violence they'd perpetrated before and during the battle. The aftermath was bleak. The Union's organizing efforts in West Virginia were crushed for over a decade. The coal companies retained their stranglehold on the region. The miners who'd fought went back to work in the same terrible conditions they'd been trying to escape. And the Battle of Blair Mountain, despite being a massive armed conflict on American soil, was quietly forgotten. It wasn't taught in schools. It was barely mentioned in history books. For decades, if you asked most Americans about it, they'd have no idea what you were talking about. Why was it forgotten? Partly because it was embarrassing. The government and coal companies had used overwhelming force, including aerial bombardment, against American workers. That didn't fit the national narrative of progress and prosperity. Partly because the miners lost, and history tends to remember winners more than losers. And partly because the people with power to shape the historical record, the coal companies, the politicians they controlled, The textbook publishers had no interest in preserving a story that made them look like villains. It wasn't until much later, really the late 20th century, that historians started seriously researching Blair Mountain and bringing it back into public awareness. In recent decades, there have been efforts to preserve the battlefield site, though those efforts have been complicated by the fact that the mountain has been heavily strip mined, literally blowing up the terrain where the battle occurred. Even in memory, the coal companies found a way to erase what happened. The Battle of Blair Mountain matters because it shows how far workers were willing to go when pushed to the breaking point, and how far the government and corporations were willing to go to maintain control. It was a war, not a skirmish, not a disturbance. A war. And the fact that most Americans don't know it happened is a testament to how effectively inconvenient history can be buried. Which brings us forward a few decades to another moment when the government turned on its own citizens, this time on a college campus, in an incident that shocked the country but whose full context is often missing. Kent State shootings. Now we're jumping forward to 1970, and we're heading to Kent State University in Ohio. This is one of those events that people have heard of, sort of. Most Americans know that something happened at Kent State, that students were shot, that it had to do with Vietnam War protests, but the details, the context, the full picture of why it happened and what it meant, those tend to get fuzzy. So let's walk through it carefully, because Kent State is important not just for what happened that day, but for what it revealed about the tensions in America during the Vietnam era and how the government was willing to respond to dissent. The backdrop is the Vietnam War, which by 1970 was deeply unpopular, especially among young people. The war had been going on for years, casualties were mounting. The draft was pulling young men into a conflict that many didn't understand or support. College campuses had become centers of anti-war activism. Protests were common, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. The Nixon administration viewed these protests as a threat, not just to war policy, but to social order generally. Nixon and his advisors talked publicly about cracking down on campus unrest. There was a real sense that the government saw student protesters as enemies, not as citizens exercising their First Amendment rights. On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced that the U.S. was expanding military operations into Cambodia. This was shocking because Nixon had campaigned on ending the war, and now he was expanding it into a neutral country. College campuses exploded with protests. At Kent State, a demonstration was held on May 1st. It was mostly peaceful, though some windows were broken in downtown Kent that night, and there was general chaos. The mayor declared a state of emergency and asked Governor James Rhodes to send in the Ohio National Guard. On May 2nd, the ROTC building on campus was set on fire and burned down. Who started the fire is unclear. Some blame protesters. Some suggest it might have been provocateurs. Regardless, the National Guard arrived in force. By May 3rd, there were about 1,000 guardsmen on campus. The situation was tense. Students resented the military presence. The guardsmen were young, not much older than the students, and many of them were tired and on edge. They'd been on duty for days dealing with a truckers' strike before being sent to Kent State. They had live ammunition in their rifles, which in hindsight seems like an insanely bad decision. But there we are. On May 4th, a rally was planned on the campus commons to protest both the Cambodia invasion and the National Guard presence. University officials tried to ban the rally, claiming it was too dangerous. Students held it anyway. Around 2,000 people gathered at midday. The National Guard attempted to disperse them using tear gas. When that didn't work, a group of about 77 guardsmen marched across the commons, driving students back. They reached a practice football field, found themselves somewhat surrounded by students on hills on three sides, and then retreated back up Blanket Hill toward the commons. What happened next is still debated, but the basic facts are clear. As the guardsmen reached the top of the hill, some of them turned and fired their rifles into the crowd of students. The shooting lasted 13 seconds. 67 rounds were fired. 4 students were struck and passed away: Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krause, William Schroeder, and Sandra Schuyer. 9 others were wounded, 1 paralyzed for life. The closest victim was about 20 feet from the guardsman. The farthest was almost 800 feet away. 2 of those who passed away, Scheuer and Schroeder, had just been walking between classes and weren't even part of the protest. The aftermath was immediate and nationwide. Students at colleges across the country went on strike. Over 4 million students participated, and over 450 universities closed, either because of protests or because administrators feared violence. There was a massive march on Washington. Public opinion, which had been mixed on campus protests, turned sharply. Seeing unarmed students shot by National Guard troops on American soil was too much even for many who'd supported the government's approach to protesters. But here's where things get complicated. The guardsmen claimed they'd felt threatened, that they'd feared for their lives, that the shooting was justified. Investigations told different stories. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest, called the Scranton Commission, concluded that the shootings were unjustified and that the guard had fired without proper authorization. The FBI investigated and found no evidence that guardsmen were in serious danger. A criminal trial of 8 guardsmen in 1974 resulted in acquittals on all charges. A civil trial in 1975 found the state of Ohio and the guardsmen not liable. It wasn't until a 1979 civil trial that a settlement was reached. The state paid $675,000 to the victims and their families, and a statement was issued that came close to an apology but carefully avoided admitting wrongdoing. No one ever went to prison. No one was convicted. The guardsmen claimed they acted in self-defense, and the legal system accepted that, despite overwhelming evidence that the students posed no lethal threat. And while Kent State became a symbol, while it sparked massive protests and helped turn public opinion against the war, the specific accountability for what happened that day never really materialized. The families of the victims spent years fighting for justice and mostly didn't get it. Kent State is also interesting because, unlike many of the events we've discussed, it wasn't erased or forgotten. It was too big, too public, too documented. There were photographs, the famous one of Mary Ann Vecchio kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body. There were hundreds of witnesses. The media covered it extensively. But what did get obscured over time was the full context. The government's increasingly hostile attitude toward protesters, the decision to send armed troops onto a college campus, the choice to give those troops live ammunition, the lack of clear rules of engagement. Kent State gets remembered as a tragedy, which it was. But it sometimes gets framed as an unfortunate accident, a tragic miscommunication, rather than what it actually was, which was the predictable result of treating American students exercising their constitutional rights as enemy combatants. And that framing matters, because if it was just an accident, just a tragic misunderstanding, then no one is really at fault. But if it was the result of policy decisions, of an administration that saw dissent as something to be crushed rather than engaged with, then someone bears responsibility, and that someone never really faced consequences. Which brings us to another example of government agencies operating in secret, doing things that would shock the public if they knew, and only getting caught because someone on the inside decided to blow the whistle. Cointtel Pro. All right. Let's talk about COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, and which is one of those things that sounds like a conspiracy theory until you realize it's completely verifiably true. This was a series of covert and often illegal operations conducted by the FBI from 1956 to 1971. The goal was to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt domestic political organizations that the FBI deemed subversive or threatening. And when I say disrupt, I don't mean they wrote stern letters. I mean they destroyed lives, broke up families, instigated violence, and in some cases, contributed to people losing their lives. And none of this would have come to light if a group of activists hadn't broken into an FBI office and stolen documents that exposed the whole operation. Let's start with the basics. COINTELPRO began in 1956 under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was, to put it mildly, obsessed with communism and anyone he perceived as a threat to American security and social order. The initial targets were members of the Communist Party USA. In Hoover's view, communists were trying to overthrow the government, so aggressive tactics to counter them were justified. But the program quickly expanded. By the 1960s, COINTELPRO was targeting civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, feminist organizations, socialist groups, and basically anyone Hoover didn't like or viewed as too radical. The tactics used were disturbing. The FBI would infiltrate organizations by planning informants or undercover agents. They'd wiretap phones and bug offices and homes, often without warrants. They'd send anonymous letters designed to create suspicion and paranoia within groups, making members distrust each other. They'd spread false rumors to discredit leaders. They'd plant fake news stories in the press. They'd inform employers about activists' political activities to get them fired. They'd contact landlords to get activists evicted. They'd send letters to spouses to break up marriages. They'd even create fake organizations that looked like legitimate activist groups, but were actually FBI fronts designed to waste activists' time and resources. One particularly vicious tactic involved exacerbating tensions between different groups to provoke violence. In some cases, the FBI would send forged letters to gang members claiming that Black Panther members were planning to attack them, or vice versa, hoping to trigger violent confrontations. And it worked. People got hurt. People lost their lives. The FBI was actively trying to get American citizens to harm each other, and they were doing it in secret with no oversight, answerable to basically no one except Hoover. The scope of COINTELPRO was enormous. Thousands of operations were conducted. The FBI opened files on tens of thousands of Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. was a major target. The FBI wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and sent him anonymous letters trying to blackmail him and encouraging him to take his own life. They sent information about his personal life to journalists, religious leaders, and government officials to try to destroy his reputation. They were trying to neutralize him, that was the actual term they used, because they saw him as a threat to social order. Not because he was violent, he explicitly advocated nonviolence, but because he was effective at challenging racism and inequality. The Black Panther Party was hit especially hard. The FBI considered them a major threat and devoted enormous resources to destroying them. They infiltrated the organization at every level. They spread disinformation to create internal conflicts. They cooperated with local police departments to raid Panther offices and homes. In Chicago in 1969, the FBI provided information that led to a police raid in which Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, was shot and passed away in his bed. Hampton had been drugged by an FBI informant so he wouldn't wake up during the raid. That's not speculation. That's documented fact that came out later. The FBI helped plan and execute a raid that resulted in a political leader being taken out in his sleep. And none of this was public. The American people had no idea their government was doing this. Congress didn't know the full extent of it. Even presidents had limited knowledge of specific operations. Hoover ran the FBI like his personal fiefdom, and COINTELPRO was his secret weapon against anyone he deemed a threat. It might never have come to light except for what happened on March 8th, 1971, in Media, Pennsylvania. A group calling themselves the Citizens Commission To investigate, the FBI broke into a small FBI field office and stole about 1,000 documents. They went through them, found evidence of Cointtel Pro operations, and sent copies to newspapers. The Washington Post published some of the documents. Slowly, the full scope of the program began to emerge. The FBI initially tried to deny it, then minimize it, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1971, Hoover officially ended Cointtel Pro, though whether some operations continued under different names is still debated. In 1975, the Church Committee, a Senate committee led by Frank Church, conducted an extensive investigation into intelligence agency abuses, including Cointtel Pro. The report, published in 1976, documented the full extent of the program and its many illegal and unethical operations. It led to reforms, including the creation of permanent intelligence oversight committees in Congress and new guidelines for FBI domestic operations. But the damage was done. Lives had been destroyed. Organizations had been crippled. Trust in government institutions had been severely damaged. What makes Cointtel Pro particularly disturbing is that it was legal authorities doing illegal things to people exercising their constitutional rights. These weren't foreign enemies. These were American citizens organizing for civil rights, protesting wars, advocating for political change, all activities protected by the First Amendment. And the FBI was systematically trying to destroy them, in secret, with no accountability. The fact that it took a burglary to expose it tells you everything you need to know about how well hidden it was, and how little chance there was of it being discovered through official channels. And here's the uncomfortable question that Cointtel Pro raises. If this was happening then, what's happening now? How many operations are currently underway that we don't know about? The FBI and other agencies have more surveillance technology now than Hoover could have dreamed of. The legal restrictions put in place after Cointtel Pro have been loosened, especially after September 11th. We know about Cointtel Pro only because it was exposed. How much don't we know? That's not paranoia. That's a reasonable question based on historical evidence. Which brings us to another secret government program, this one involving medical experimentation on people who had no idea what was being done to them. Tuskegee syphilis study. Now we need to talk about one of the most unethical medical research studies ever conducted in the United States. Something so disturbing that when it finally came to light in 1972, it fundamentally changed how medical research is regulated and conducted. This is the Tuskegee syphilis study, officially called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, which ran from 1932 to 1972. 40 years. 4 decades of lying to patients, denying them treatment, and watching them suffer and pass away, all in the name of science. And the fact that this was a government program run by the U.S. Public Health Service makes it even worse. Here's how it started. In 1932, the Public Health Service wanted to study the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that, if left untreated, can cause serious complications, including damage to the heart, brain, and other organs, eventually leading to passing away. At the time, the available treatments were toxic and not very effective, though they were better than nothing. The researchers decided to find a population that already had syphilis and follow them over time to see how the disease progressed without treatment. They chose Macon County, Alabama, where there were high rates of syphilis among poor black sharecroppers. They recruited 600 black men, 399 who had syphilis, and 201 who didn't as a control group. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that could mean several things, including syphilis, anemia, or general fatigue. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not told they were part of a research study. They were told they were receiving free medical care, which was a big draw because most of these men had never seen a doctor in their lives. They were poor, they had no access to health care, The offer of free medical exams and treatment was something they couldn't refuse, except they weren't being treated. They received aspirin and iron supplements, which did nothing for syphilis. They underwent painful and unnecessary spinal taps, which were described to them as special free treatment, when actually the taps were just to monitor the disease's progression in their spinal fluid. The whole thing was a lie from the start. And here's the truly evil part. In 1947, penicillin became widely available and was recognized as an effective treatment for syphilis. The researchers knew this. They deliberately prevented the men in the study from receiving penicillin. They tracked them through local health departments to make sure they didn't get treated elsewhere. When men tried to enlist in World War II and would have received treatment as part of their military medical exams, the researchers intervened to keep them out of the draft so they'd remain untreated. For 40 years, these men were denied treatment for a curable disease. Many of them passed away from syphilis-related complications. Some went blind. Some developed severe mental impairment. And because syphilis can be transmitted, their wives got infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. The damage spread to families, to generations, all because researchers wanted to observe what untreated syphilis looked like and decided that was more important than the lives and health of the people they were studying. The study was finally exposed in 1972 when Peter Buxton, a public health service employee, leaked information about it to the press. He'd actually tried to report it internally years earlier in 1966, but was ignored. When the story broke, the public outcry was immediate and intense. How could the government do this? How could doctors, people who'd taken an oath to do no harm, stand by and watch people suffer and pass away when treatment was available? The study was immediately shut down. An advisory panel was formed to investigate. In 1973, the government agreed to provide lifetime medical and burial services to surviving participants and their families. In 1974, a class action lawsuit was settled for $10 million, about $9 million in legal fees, and about $37,000 for each participant and heir. But money doesn't undo 40 years of suffering. It doesn't bring back the people who passed away. It doesn't cure the children born with congenital syphilis. And it doesn't erase the profound breach of trust between the Black community and the medical establishment. The Tuskegee study is one of the major reasons why many Black Americans are, to this day, distrustful of medical research and government health programs. That distrust isn't irrational. It's based on historical evidence that the government cannot be trusted to protect Black lives when science or policy goals are at stake. The study led to major reforms in how medical research is conducted. In 1974, the National Research Act was passed, establishing institutional review boards to oversee research involving human subjects and requiring informed consent. The Belmont Report in 1979 established ethical principles for research. These were necessary and important changes, but they came 40 years too late for the men in Tuskegee. In 1997, President Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. He called the study shameful and racist. He was right. But apologies don't change what happened. They don't restore health or lives. They're an acknowledgement, which matters, but they're not justice. The men who designed and ran the study never faced criminal charges. They faced criticism, certainly, and professional consequences, but no one went to jail for what was essentially a 40-year campaign of medical torture. The Tuskegee study is important not just because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about how racism can infect institutions and make the unthinkable seem acceptable. The researchers didn't see what they were doing as wrong. They saw these men as subjects, not people. They saw knowledge as more valuable than Black lives. And they operated openly, publishing papers about the study in medical journals because in the medical community of the time, this kind of research on poor black patients wasn't seen as particularly problematic. That's horrifying. The fact that it took 40 years and a whistleblower for anyone to say, wait, this is wrong, tells you everything about how normalized this kind of abuse was. Which brings us to another program where the government decided that Native children were subjects to be experimented on, not people to be protected. Indian boarding schools. Now we're going back in time a bit to the late 1800s, but the effects lasted well into the 20th century, really until the 1970s in some cases. We need to talk about Indian boarding schools, which were institutions designed explicitly to destroy Native American culture, language, and identity. The phrase that was used, coined by Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879, was kill the Indian, save the man. That was the stated goal. Not education, not opportunity, cultural extermination. And for about a century, the US government ran or funded a system of schools that took Native children from their families, often by force, and attempted to erase everything that made them who they were. Here's how it worked. Starting in the late 1800s and continuing through much of the 20th century, Native children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools. Sometimes parents were given a choice: send your children to school or lose government rations and support that your family needed to survive. Sometimes children were just taken, with Indian agents showing up at reservations and literally removing children from their homes. The children were often very young, sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old. They were sent to schools that were sometimes hundreds of miles from their homes, making family visits impossible. When the children arrived at these schools, the first thing that happened was a systematic stripping of their identity. Their hair was cut, which in many Native cultures was a significant spiritual and cultural violation. They were given English names to replace their native names. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, even to each other. If they were caught speaking their language, they were punished, sometimes severely. They were given uniforms. They were taught that their culture was primitive and savage, that their religions were evil, that their families were backwards. The entire curriculum was designed to make them ashamed of being Native and to teach them to adopt white American culture and values. The conditions in many of these schools were terrible. Overcrowding was common. Sanitation was poor. Food was inadequate. Medical care was minimal. Disease spread easily. Tuberculosis, measles, and influenza outbreaks swept through schools regularly. The death rate at some schools was staggering. Children lost their lives from disease, from malnutrition, from accidents, from abuse. When they passed away, they were often buried on school grounds in unmarked graves. Their families sometimes weren't even notified. Parents would send their children away and never see them again, never knowing what happened to them. The abuse wasn't just neglect. There was physical abuse. Children were beaten for speaking their language, for trying to run away, for breaking rules. There was emotional and psychological abuse. Children were told they were worthless, that their families were shameful, that everything about their culture was wrong, and there was sexual abuse. Many survivors have come forward in recent decades to describe being sexually assaulted by staff members. The abuse was widespread, systematic, and covered up by the institutions and the government agencies that oversaw them. And it wasn't a small program. Hundreds of schools operated across the United States and Canada. Tens of thousands of children went through them over the decades. For many Native communities, an entire generation of children was removed, and when those children returned, they were traumatized, disconnected from their culture, unable to speak their language, and often struggling with the psychological damage of years of abuse. They couldn't pass their culture and language to their own children because it had been beaten out of them, That's intergenerational trauma. That's cultural genocide. The schools began to close in the 1960s and 70s as policies finally started to shift towards supporting native self determination rather than forced assimilation. But the damage was done. Languages were lost or nearly lost. Cultural practices were disrupted or forgotten. Families were fractured. The trauma affected not just the children who attended the schools, but their children and grandchildren. Rates of substance abuse, suicide, and mental illness in Native communities today can be traced directly to the boarding school system and the trauma it inflicted. For a very long time, this history was not widely taught or acknowledged. The schools were often described as providing education and opportunity for Native children, as if they were charitable institutions rather than instruments of cultural destruction. Textbooks, when they mentioned the schools at all, used sanitized language that obscured what actually happened. Assimilation programs sounds a lot less horrifying than systematic cultural genocide. The survivors' stories were ignored or dismissed. The unmarked graves were forgotten. It wasn't until recently, really the 21st century, that there's been a serious reckoning with this history. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission conducted a comprehensive investigation from 2008 to 2015, documenting the abuses and calling them cultural genocide. In the United States, the process has been slower, but there's growing awareness and calls for similar investigations and accountability. Ground penetrating radar has been used at former school sites and has found hundreds of unmarked graves, confirming what survivors have been saying for years. Children went to these schools and never came home. The Indian boarding school system is one of those things that should be central to American history education, but isn't. It went on for decades. It affected hundreds of thousands of people. It was official government policy. And it was designed to destroy entire cultures. That's not ancient history. The last of these schools didn't close until the 1970s. There are people alive today who attended them. There are thousands of people dealing with the trauma their parents or grandparents experienced. This is living history. And for most of the 20th century, it was history that was deliberately obscured, downplayed, and erased from the national narrative. Which brings us to one final example from 1919, a year that saw racial violence erupt in dozens of cities across America in what became known as Red Summer. Red Summer. Now we're going to talk about the summer of 1919, which has a name that sounds almost poetic until you understand what it means. Red Summer. The color refers to blood. During the summer and surrounding months of 1919, racial violence erupted in dozens of cities across the United States. We're not talking about isolated incidents. We're talking about a wave of violence that swept through urban America, north and south, east and west, leaving hundreds of people gone and thousands more injured or displaced. And the official narrative at the time, and for decades afterward, framed this as a series of spontaneous riots, random outbreaks of racial tension, rather than what it actually was, which was organized white supremacist terror in response to Black Americans demanding equality and fair treatment. Let's set the context, because Red Summer didn't happen in a vacuum. World War I had just ended. Over 350,000 Black Americans had served in the military. They'd fought for democracy abroad, and they came home expecting to be treated as full citizens. They weren't. They returned to the same segregation, the same discrimination, the same violence they'd left behind, except now they were less willing to accept it. The Great Migration was in full swing, with hundreds of thousands of Black Americans moving from the rural South to northern and western cities looking for jobs and better lives. This created tension in cities that weren't used to large Black populations. White workers saw Black workers as competition for jobs and housing. Labor unions, rather than organizing workers across racial lines, often excluded black members and stoked racial resentment. At the same time, there was a resurgence of white supremacist organizing. The Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a revival. White supremacist ideology was mainstream, not fringe. Movies like The Birth of a Nation, which portrayed the Klan as heroes, were enormous box office successes. The idea that black people demanding equality were a threat to white America was widely accepted in white communities. So you had black veterans returning and demanding rights, black workers moving north and competing for jobs, and white communities reacting with fear and violence. It was a perfect storm. The violence began even before summer. In April, there was an incident in Jenkins County, Georgia. In May, violence in Charleston, South Carolina. But things really escalated in the summer months. On July the 13th, violence erupted in Longview, Texas. On July 19th, Washington, D.C. experienced several days of violence after white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, and black residents armed themselves and fought back. On July 27th, Chicago exploded. A black teenager named Eugene Williams was swimming in Lake Michigan and drifted across the informal boundary that separated the white and black sections of the beach. White beachgoers threw rocks at him. He drowned. Police refused to arrest the white men responsible. Black beachgoers were outraged. Violence spread throughout the city. It lasted for days. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods. Black residents defended themselves. By the time it ended, 38 people were gone, 23 black and 15 white, and over 500 were injured. 1,000 black families were left homeless after their homes were burned. And it didn't stop there. Knoxville, Tennessee in August, Omaha, Nebraska in September, Elaine, Arkansas, which we've already discussed, in late September and early October. In total, historians have documented violence in at least 25 cities during 1919, and those are just the major incidents that made the news. There were countless smaller incidents that went unreported or were reported only locally. Conservative estimates put the death toll at several hundred, but the real number was almost certainly higher because many bodies, particularly in rural areas and small towns, were never officially counted or reported. What makes Red Summer particularly significant is how the violence was framed at the time and for decades afterward. White newspapers called them race riots, which implied that both sides were equally responsible, that it was just chaos and random violence. But that's not what happened. In most cases, white mobs initiated the violence, often with the participation or at least tacit approval of local police. Black residents defended themselves, which is a basic human right. But the official narrative often portrayed black self-defense as aggression. Headlines would read things like, "Negro mob attacks white neighborhood," when what actually happened was that black residents fought back against white mobs that had been attacking their communities. The other thing that's crucial to understand about Red Summer is that it wasn't just mob violence, it was state-sanctioned terror in many cases. Police participated in attacks. Local governments did little or nothing to stop the violence and often arrested black residents for defending themselves rather than white attackers. Federal troops, when they were deployed, often sided with white mobs or stood by while violence continued. The message was clear. Black Americans could not count on the government to protect them. If they defended themselves, they'd be arrested. If they didn't defend themselves, they'd be attacked with impunity. In the aftermath, there were investigations and reports, but very few prosecutions and even fewer convictions of white rioters. The NAACP documented the violence and published reports, but mainstream white America largely moved on. The violence was treated as an unfortunate series of incidents rather than a coordinated campaign of terror. And here's the really disturbing part. In many cases, the violence worked. Black populations in some cities declined after Red Summer as people fled to safer areas. Black economic progress was set back as businesses were destroyed and property was lost. The message was sent and received. If Black Americans got too uppity, if they demanded too much, violence would follow and the government wouldn't protect them. For decades, Red Summer was barely taught in schools. It didn't fit into the narrative of American progress. It was too ugly, too recent, too close to the World War I victory celebrations and the roaring 20s prosperity that followed. It was easier to just not talk about it, to let it fade from national memory, even as it remained vivid in the memories of Black communities who'd lived through it. It wasn't until much later, when historians started seriously examining racial violence in American history, that Red Summer was recovered from obscurity and recognized as a pivotal moment. A moment when Black Americans returning from war said, "We deserve better," and white America responded with violence. A moment when the promise of democracy abroad highlighted the hypocrisy of oppression at home. A moment that showed just how far the country was from living up to its stated ideals. Red Summer matters because it shows the pattern we've seen throughout this documentary. Violence happens, it gets mischaracterized, the official narrative obscures what actually occurred. And decades pass before the truth is widely acknowledged. It also shows how language matters. Calling something a riot when it was actually a coordinated attack shifts the blame and makes it easier to move on without accountability. And Red Summer shows how Black Americans have always had to fight for basic rights and dignity, often literally, in the face of state-sanctioned violence and public indifference. The teenagers who drowned in Chicago because he crossed an imaginary line on a beach should be a story everyone knows. Instead, it's a footnote, one incident among many that got buried under sanitized history. Which brings us to our final event, something that happened much more recently in 1985 in a major American city, and which remains shocking in its brutality and in the lack of accountability that followed. Move bombing. All right, we've reached our final event, and we're jumping forward to 1985, to Philadelphia, to an incident that is so wild, so completely unbelievable, that if you made it up for a movie, people would say it was too far-fetched. On May 13th, 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped an explosive device from a helicopter onto a residential home in West Philadelphia. The resulting fire destroyed over 60 homes and ended the lives of 11 people, including 5 children. And somehow, incredibly, no government officials or police officers were ever criminally charged for this. Let that sink in for a moment. A major American city bombed its own neighborhood from the air, and no one went to jail. Let's back up and explain how we got to the point where this seemed like a reasonable course of action to anyone. The story starts with a group called MOVE, which was founded in Philadelphia in the early 1970s by John Africa, whose birth name was Vincent Leapart. MOVE was difficult to categorize. They were part Back to Nature movement, part political organization, part religious group. They advocated for animal rights, opposed technology and modern medicine, and believed in a philosophy they called the teachings of John Africa. Members took Africa as their last name. They wore their hair in dreadlocks. They lived communally. They composted. They were vegan. In many ways, they sound like a hippie commune, but they were also confrontational. They protested loudly, sometimes aggressively. They got into conflicts with neighbors over noise and sanitation issues. And crucially, they were predominantly Black. And Philadelphia in the 1970s and 80s was a city with serious racial tensions and a police department with a well-documented history of brutality, particularly toward Black residents. By the late 70s, MOVE's relationship with the city had deteriorated badly. In 1978, police raided the MOVE headquarters in Powelton Village. There was a shootout. One police officer was struck and passed away. 9 MOVE members were convicted of his demise and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, though questions remained about who actually fired the fatal shot and whether the trials were fair. After that raid, the remaining MOVE members relocated to a row house at 6221 Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. They fortified the house. They built a bunker-like structure on the roof. They had loudspeakers that used to broadcast their views and complaints at all hours. Their neighbors were, understandably, frustrated. The situation was tense, but it was manageable. Until May of 1985. Mayor Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first black mayor, decided that MOVE needed to be evicted from the Osage Avenue house. There were outstanding arrest warrants for some members on various charges. The complaints from neighbors were mounting. The city wanted to resolve the situation. But instead of negotiating, instead of cutting off utilities and waiting them out, instead of any number of less confrontational approaches, the city decided on a show of force. On the morning of May 13th, police surrounded the house with about 500 officers. They evacuated neighboring homes. They tried to force MOVE members out with tear gas and high-pressure water hoses. MOVE members fired back. There was an exchange of gunfire. Then someone, and the decision-making chain here remains murky, decided to drop an explosive on the bunker on the roof to breach it and force the residents out. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter flew over the house and dropped a bomb made of FBI-supplied C4 explosive and Tovex, a commercial explosive. The bomb hit the roof bunker and detonated. It started a fire. And here's where things go from bad to catastrophic. The fire department was on scene. They had water. They could have put the fire out immediately. But the decision was made to let the fire burn to destroy the bunker. That's a direct quote from Fire Commissioner William Richmond. Let the fire burn. On a row house, in a densely packed residential neighborhood, where houses share walls, the fire spread fast. The wind was blowing. The houses were old and dry. Within an hour, the fire was out of control. It jumped from house to house down the entire block. Firefighters eventually tried to fight it, but by then it was too late. 61 homes were destroyed. 250 people were left homeless. And 11 MOVE members inside the original house perished in the fire, including 5 children aged 7 to 13. Only 2 people escaped the house, Ramona Africa and a 13-year-old boy named Bertie Africa. Ramona Africa later testified that police fired at MOVE members who tried to escape the burning house, forcing them back inside. The police denied this, but multiple witnesses reported seeing police shoot at people fleeing the building. The aftermath was immediate outrage. How could this happen? How could the police drop a bomb on a residential neighborhood? How could the fire department let it burn? How could 11 people, including 5 children, perish while police and firefighters stood by? There were investigations. The Philadelphia Special Investigation Commission, called the MOVE Commission, issued a report that criticized basically everyone involved. They called the decision to drop the bomb reckless, ill-conceived, and hastily approved. They said the fire department's decision to let the fire burn was unconscionable. They recommended that criminal charges be pursued against city officials, but criminal charges never came. No police officers were charged. No fire department officials were charged. Mayor Goode was not charged. The only person who faced criminal charges from that day was Ramona Africa, who was convicted of riot and conspiracy and served 7 years in prison. The survivor of the bombing went to prison while the people who dropped the bomb and let the fire burn went free. The logic was incomprehensible. The city eventually paid $35 million in civil settlements to survivors and residents who lost their homes, which was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing but not accountability. Money from taxpayers, while the officials who made the decisions faced no personal consequences. The MOVE bombing is significant for several reasons. First, it shows how far authorities were willing to go against a group they viewed as threatening, even when that group included children. Second, it demonstrates the double standard in how force is applied. It's difficult to imagine a predominantly white group being bombed from a helicopter by police. Third, it shows how quickly something can spiral from law enforcement action to disaster when there's no accountability or oversight. And fourth, it illustrates the pattern we've seen throughout this documentary. Something terrible happens, there's initial outrage, investigations occur, reports are written, and then nothing. No one goes to jail. The victims or survivors, if anyone, face consequences. The officials responsible move on with their lives and careers. For decades, the move bombing was largely forgotten outside of Philadelphia. It was a local story. It happened in the mid-80s when there was lots of other news. It involved a group that many people found weird or threatening. It was easy to dismiss as an unfortunate but isolated incident. But in recent years, there's been renewed attention to MOVE, particularly as conversations about police violence and accountability have intensified. People look back at May 13, 1985 and ask, how did this happen? How was this allowed? And perhaps most importantly, how did no one go to prison for dropping a bomb on a residential neighborhood and letting 11 people burn? The MOVE bombings are final event because it's recent enough that many of us were alive when it happened. It's not ancient history. It's not something from a different era. It happened in 1985 in a major American city with news cameras rolling. And yet it was minimized, explained away, and largely forgotten until people started asking uncomfortable questions about why we don't talk about it more. It's a reminder that the pattern of erasing or downplaying difficult history didn't end in the 19th century or even the 20th. It continues. Events happen, they get framed in ways that obscure what actually occurred, and then they slip from public consciousness unless people actively work to keep them remembered. And that ultimately is why we've spent the last however long talking about the 17 events. Because memory matters, truth matters, and the people who suffered through these events deserve to have their stories told accurately, even when, especially when, those stories make us uncomfortable. And that brings us to the end of our journey through these 17 darkest events. From 1838 to 1985, from forced marches to police bombings, from incidents that happened in remote territories to violence in major cities. Different times, different places, different circumstances, but all connected by the same thread. Powerful people doing terrible things, and then working very hard to make sure the story got told their way, or didn't get told at all. The thing is, none of this is truly erased. It can't be. The descendants of people who lived through these events carry the stories, the trauma, the knowledge of what actually happened. And slowly, painfully, those stories make their way back into the light. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when it takes a century. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe think about what other stories might still be waiting to be told. What other uncomfortable truths are sitting in archives, waiting for someone to care enough to look. History isn't finished with us yet. We're still writing it. We're still deciding which stories matter. Sleep well. And remember, the past isn't really past. It's just waiting for us to pay attention.